Okay, so all right, just one more. Okay, so let me share my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, so you can see my screen, all right?
Yes. Yeah,
All right. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. So couple of about 4 weeks ago, when I spoke about the fact that I had interest in yoga, and I'm actually learning to be training to be a yoga teacher at this time. So some of you reached out saying, "Hey, we'd love to know more." So this is one of my favorite topics, I would say, in terms of how do we use this for mental health and mental well-being. So that's the part I'm going to focus on today. Obviously, yoga as a physical exercise is very well known. I don't have to go into that. I mean, it's been marketed so well. So that's how people know it today. But before I get started, I just wanted to say, gratitude to the rishis and the gurus who have kept this knowledge for thousands of years. Literally, it's at least 5,000 plus years old. And if you think about it, it's carried over from one generation to the other, primarily through Shruti, as in they orally transmitted it and then eventually got written down, right? So it's phenomenal if you think about the fact that we are talking about this today, 5,000 years plus later, right? So, and the fact that there are so many teachers all over the world today who are also tirelessly teaching this and spreading this knowledge to people. Right, and thanks to the internet that made it even possible. As I was just telling Sony here earlier, that previously to gain this type of knowledge, we had to go to something like the Himalayas to actually see, but not anymore. We are able to stay in the comfort of our homes and listen to this as a podcast on YouTube, what have you, right? So, all right. The other, in terms of the agenda, right, I want to split it into three sections or three parts, right? The first part, I would like to start about, again, we are talking about yoga for mental health. So we'll talk about the problem statement of what it is, right? And then we'll talk about what is yoga and how is it connected to the problem statement. And then eventually we'll talk about the practice of yoga, right? And what are those practices? What does it look like? We obviously know that yoga has many, many benefits at the anatomical, the physical body level, the physiological level, right? Which, whether it's breathing, whether it's digestion, all the internal processes, the physiological processes, there's a lot of, and at the nervous level, the nervous system level, there are many. The focus today, though, is going to be on the mental aspects, because I feel it's much less understood. Though the tragedy is that that was the main reason yoga was even instrumental. So that was the main core part of it. But then people have taken small pieces of it and have lost the core message. So in my journey, personal journey, I wanted to go beyond the marketing hype of yoga, and go beyond that to see what was the core message. Right. And to do that, I also had to go beyond the books and the materials that are available today to go to the source. And we'll talk more about that, on what that source is and what we can learn from it. All right. And to do that, let's start a little at the grandiose level, right? So Shankar, would you be able to admit people as they come in? So let's start at the grandiose level, which is, wait, am I recording? Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Do you see recording sign? Yeah, it is right. Okay. So let's start by asking ourselves, what is like the purpose of life, right? So we seldom do that. We take things for granted, and we kind of go into almost like a just because we just go into a certain set of things that we do in life, just because that's what we have seen, that's what we have seen others do, our peers, our parents, So we just take that for granted and keep going, right? But we never stop back to ask ourselves, what exactly do we want in life? But if you were to kind of peel the layers of the onion, right? People might say, I'm looking for obviously fame, wealth, power, these gadgets and houses and whatnot, right? The material things that we normally hear. And that's completely fine. But then as you ask why, and then as you keep going down this path, you eventually see that most people are looking for happiness, right? There's peace of mind. You're looking for happiness. We are looking for security, right? So most of these things can be resolved into happiness, peace, and security, right? So this is what we kind of seek in life, if you really think about it, and we want to avoid certain things. Whether it's stress, anxiety, there are fears and disappointments that come along the way, and we are all old enough to have gone through many cycles of these in our own personal lives, and we kind of know what these things are, and we want to avoid certain situations. We want to hold on to certain other situations. So this is kind of our current behavior in general as humans, right? So now we tie our happiness and we seek happiness outside, and we're looking at it from the standpoint of people, place, things, situations, what have you, right? So when we were in college, we were in school, we wanted to get into a good college. We finally get there, right? And it seemed like that's like in school, it seemed like, hey, as long as I just get into this top college, I'll be really happy, right? And then we get there, right? And then what? The happiness lasts for a few months, and soon that tapers away. And now the next thing comes along, which is, hey, I somehow need to get a good job, right? And so on. Now we want to earn more money, and we get a house, we want a bigger house, and so on and so forth, right? Now we're looking for a relationship at that point. So this thing continues, and we are, by default, we just go into this. We don't step out and see what else, and is there something more to it? We are in it and completely immersed in it, right? And nothing wrong with it, but it almost seems like we are telling ourselves, you know what, happiness is just around the corner. Just let me reach there, and then I'll be happy, right? And then when we reach there, we see that, hey, you know what, another, it's not exactly what I thought it would be. It is just one more mile away, just around the next corner, right? So this is kind of how we are behaving today. And, it almost seems like when we reach there, it doesn't last. It is there, that is for sure. There is some happiness. We experience that for sure, but then it doesn't last. It almost seems like somebody has moved the goalposts, and now we have to find something more again, right? So that is one aspect. It doesn't last, and we can see this for ourselves. The second aspect is we always tie happiness to something else, right? I'll be happy when certain things happen. A certain situation happens, when I acquire something, when I get rid of something, when I achieve something, right? So when we think of happiness and when we try to define it for ourselves, we always connect it to, I'll be happy when something happens, right? So, and on top of that, we are also ready to endure some kind of suffering as long as we achieve these things, because we strongly believe as long as we get that, we are going to be happy, right? So it's almost as if there is this condition, we're all engineers here, in terms of an equation, we are happy when certain things are met. And in addition, we also assume almost by default, that happiness results from acquiring or achieving more and more desires, right? So, so let's say we have a certain number of desires at the denominator, and we feel that, hey, as long as we keep achieving, you know what, as the numerator increases, my happiness is going to increase. Straightforward, right? It seems like that's how it should be, and we go ahead and keep checking off things in the list. And but what happens is that as we start checking off the list of desires that we fulfill, the total number of desires keeps increasing. This is something we did not expect. So, for instance, we buy, we eventually buy a beautiful house, but then now you have obviously a lot more desires in terms of, okay, I need to furnish this, I need a huge garden, so to take care of that, I have a few other things, right? So, and so on and so forth. So what nature has done is basically, as we fulfill desires, more things get added to the denominator, right? This seems to happen, and which means that the denominator has increased here, and the happiness goes away after some time. This seems to happen. We can relate to it. Now, and then soon we are back in our hamster wheel. We are stuck back in this, and we continue to run. So this is the current situation for many, most of humanity. We are here, right? So now the question we can ask ourselves, again, with respect to the mental well-being part, is that process really consumes us. We are stressed along the way because we are trying to do these things. We achieve it. The achievement itself causes so much stress. And then when we achieve it, we don't get the level of happiness that we thought or assumed that we will get. That causes stress, and eventually it results in a even when things are generally happy. Not everyone is quote unquote suffering at all times in that sense. It seems but behind that, below that surface level, there seems to be an undercurrent of dissatisfaction that happens, right? So is it even possible for us to find long-lasting happiness? Permanent happiness, is it possible, right? So that's the question that we could ask ourselves. Why not? Is it even possible? We can obviously, let's do a little bit of analysis. But before I go into that, I just want to mention, if there are any questions, please put it in the chat and we can definitely take it up so you don't lose track of it. So let's do a little bit of analysis ourselves, right? So we find that what happens is there is this law of diminishing returns that plays a part, a big part. We buy a new car, a new gadget, a new house, and what have you. Initially, it's all amazing. It feels like you are on top of the world. It feels like you are extremely happy. But then soon, after a few weeks or months or weeks, whatever, it starts to look as if that's just become the new normal. And that's gone out of the way. That's no longer giving you the same amount of happiness that it gave on the very first day that you bought it. Right now, that's just normal. In the same way, let's take a look at another one, which is, let's say you bought a house. Now, the buyer is really happy that they have acquired a house. The seller is equally or even more happier that they sold the house, right? Now, the question is, if this is, both of them are true, how can the house be the source of happiness? If you really think about it, we assume that because of the house, I'm happy as the buyer. But the seller is equally happy because they sold the house, they got rid of it, and they're happy. So this doesn't seem logical that if the source of happiness is the house, it should be able to give happiness to everyone at all times. So one is getting happier because they got rid of it. The other is happier because they acquired it. So should be clear to us that house cannot be the source of happiness in this case. Now, replace house with car or whatever else other material things here, you would realize that cannot be the source of happiness, right? So in the same way, yet another example, you listen to good music, somebody else does not like it, you like it. And it isn't the same kind of relationship here, right? Even when you look at relationships between people, we see that people again change and evolve over time, and when expectations are met between the people in a relationship, we are generally happy. But when expectations are not met, we slowly drift apart, right? So there is that, again, it's conditional is kind of what I wanted to point out here, even in relation, in all of these types of happiness that relates to people, place, things, situations, it becomes a conditional source of happiness. So when certain things are met, when certain conditions are met, I'll be happy. If not, no, right? So, all right. Now, okay, sorry, I skipped. Actually, here's an interesting one. I just thought about this, saying, hey, if I were to put a list of people, some people obviously with power and fame, obviously with wealth, with great looks, great sporting abilities or skills, you name it, right? Now, in this picture here, if I were to ask you, who do you think is the happier amongst these people here, these personalities that I put up here, what would we naturally tend towards, right? And at least two people on this list have openly spoken about their struggles with depression. I'll not name it because, but at least two people here, and I can tell you it's not Dalai Lama. So, but naturally we tend towards the Dalai Lama or Buddha, right? We somehow know that these people are the ones who might be the most happiest in this list here, right? Why does that happen? What connection did we make to kind of say that, hey, maybe it's the Dalai Lama who's the happiest amongst this set of people here? What is it that we naturally tended towards, right? So it's something interesting for us to think about. Now, as you go through this deeper introspection of this, you realize a breakthrough, which is that this is an important one, actually, to recognize that the external objects, be it people, place, things, etc., cannot give us long-lasting happiness. It cannot, because things change. Things change, and that's the nature. Whether everything changes, and if happiness is tied to something that's changing in a really very ad hoc, random fashion, your happiness cannot be stable. It's going to change along with it. And so, you know, because of which, eventually you're going to find yourself in an unhappy position. But we somehow wrongly assumed that those are the sources. But if you step back, really think about it, it becomes clear that those cannot be the sources of long-lasting happiness. It does give some level of happiness, but it's a lower grade of happiness, which is dependent. Instead, can we look for something higher, is the question, right? So with that, I didn't find enough time to actually make a slide out of this, but here's one from my small whiteboard here. But this is kind of what happens. So let's take a look at this, right? So we acquire people, place, thing, relationships, situations, what have you. And if those are favorable, we are happy and we want more of it, right? And when we want more of it, we go through the upper loop. We start to cling towards it. We develop strong affinity, strong bonding towards that. And then we keep going into that loop. But at some point, you come out of that and say it stops giving you that same level of happiness because of the law of diminishing returns. And so the same thing that earlier gave you X amount of happiness no longer does that. You can take a look at something as simple as maybe a laddu that we eat or a sweet that you like. You take one, it gives you a certain amount of happiness. You take two, you would think, oh, now it gave me X amount of happiness. I take 3 of them, it's going to give me 3X, right? Well, tough luck. No, it doesn't happen. Law of diminishing returns kicks in. And after the 3rd or 4th, you're actually starting to hate it at this point because it's starting to give you a stomachache. So the aversion happens. We go through the bottom loop here, and now you want something else. And that something else, we start working towards that something else, again, goes into this loop. We are constantly in this loop, one way or the other. Now, to me, and in this loop, we have, there is stress, anxiety, fears, it's all built in. because not everything we want, we can get. So for instance, when there are things that prevent us from getting it, we become angry, we get frustrated, and that leads us into its own set of problems because of what we do because of that, right? So it gets us into multiple nested loops from here on, right? So when we step back and take a look at it, we see that happiness somehow results from how we relate to the external objects. But the external objects themselves cannot be the source, but how we relate to it, the likes and dislikes of the external object. In other words, the happiness happens in my mind, and hence it should be in my own control, right? In our own control. So, so this is an important insight too, because now you're disconnecting happiness and saying that, hey, happiness is expressed and seen in my own mind, observed in my own mind. So it should be in my own control. Now, even if I take away the external objects, since happiness happens in my mind, well, in theory, we should be able to stay happy regardless of what happens outside of it, right? So, and that's kind of where we are coming at this, saying it seems like it's possible. Let's take a look, right? So, and this is where I know a long-winded, I would say, problem statement, but I thought it was very important to present that because that's where yoga at the core deals with that problem. And this was recognized as a problem 5,000 plus years ago. And if anything, it's even more so of a problem today with all the distractions and the additional stresses that we go through today compared to how it was back then, right? So let me stop here for a minute, see if there are any questions. If not, I can keep going and we can take the questions in the end.
There is no questions in the chat message. Anybody, any questions?
Okay, let's go ahead, and we can always have the discussion towards the end if there are. Okay.
There is a one question.
Yeah, it's a comment. It's not a discussion, so it's just
okay.
a comment that I put. Okay, so.
Okay.
All right, but is it overall? Is it?
It is my thing is that okay, if everybody is happy, there is it can affect the progress of or the what we call the development of human civilization, right? No, there's no drive, right? Part of the drive comes from people being unhappy, right? That strives to new behavior, new innovation, and new things, right? So that's all. It's just a comment that I put in there.
I see what you're getting at, and that's a common. I would say a good argument there, and I would say it depends on what we define as happiness.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
All right. So I'll take a small detour here to kind of talk about yoga at this point, right? Just to give a sense of where it started. The earliest writings or references rather of yoga shows up in the Upanishads, right? In the Vedas, which are dated 1500, at least 3500 to 4000 years ago. And there are references to that. And then later on in the Bhagavad Gita, when that got eventually written, there are strong references to yoga there. And at some point, there was a sage called Patanjali who came along, and around the time of Buddha as well. In fact, probably some people date him after Buddha, some people date him just before Buddha, and so on. So he came along around that time. I actually, in the Upanishadic age, in 4,000 plus years ago, there was almost a renaissance of sorts of spiritual thinking, right? There was a huge renaissance of, and the type of body of work that was created around that time was just phenomenal. But it lost its way over time, and things became very ritualistic over time. So Patanjali came along, and he wanted to resurrect the old way, the higher way of thinking. So he actually compiled what is called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, right? So he states that in the very first sutra of Patanjali, where he says, of Yoga Sutras, where he says, I am basically rewriting or stating it again for the benefit of humanity, right? So he basically says that this is not my original work, but I'm going to bring it back together, right? So we'll talk more about that in a minute here.
Kishore, are you saying the Vedas are the origination of yoga? Is that what the...
No, the references to yoga is found in different Upanishads. And Vedas themselves are split into at least four different parts. And one part of it, they call the Vedanta, which is the higher, they called as the philosophical aspects of it, is where they find references to yoga.
Okay, I see.
And then eventually, but today the book that's most popularly referred to in terms of the source of yoga is the Yoga Sutras. But it got compiled later, and Patanjali says that in the very first one, saying that it's actually a recompilation, and he's stating it again. All right.
These slides you are going to share with us, right?
I can. Yeah.
Okay.
So and then there were different periods, and there is another thing called the Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga is basically focused on from the physical to the spiritual, and Patanjali's Yoga Sutra starts at the spiritual level, at the mental level, right? It doesn't go too much into the physical aspects of it, as you will see. So a lot of what you see today as yoga with all the physical aspects of it went with the Hatha Yoga side of things, which is, I should add that here, as I realized it here. And there was a dry period for a long period of time until Vivekananda and eventually people like Krishnamacharya took this along and started to create the whole thing again. And then it came to the US and so on, right? Okay, I think we covered this. The Yoga Sutras themselves are 195, sometimes 196 in certain compilations. So there's those sutras, what they mean by that is they're very short, concise, unambiguous. It's phenomenal in terms of how you look at it. So the meaning that needs to be conveyed is conveyed in the most concise way, and that is the format of a sutra. So it doesn't have any, it's obviously written in Sanskrit, but it doesn't have any extra things there, right? They wanted to keep it concise because these were memorized and passed along through Shruti, through oral means, and hence they wanted to keep it in a very concise way, right? And out of this, there are only 3 sutras out of 195 that talk about asanas, and only 6 for pranayama. In the whole of the rest of it is all about the mind. So Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, to my complete astonishment when I started learning this first time, it was all about the mind. It was psychology 101, about how the mind works, and goes in depth into each part of it, and how to deal with things and so on, right? So that's where I found this to be fascinating, that this is kind of locked in an ancient scripture, but it's more relevant today than it was when Patanjali, actually wrote this. And it needs to come out. It needs to be spoken about. And glad it's happening. It's happening today. Okay, so just to again, now the detour completed, we go back to how does yoga connect to the topic of happiness that we started talking about.
So you mentioned Patanjali, right? After Patanjali, there were other versions of yoga coming out, right? So later in the cycle. How are these? So they take Patanjali's yoga, the sutra, and redefine it? Is that what's happening in later period of time? Okay. Yeah,
great question. So yes, there were many streams. Like if you look at, there was this Nath tradition, they call it NATH, Nath tradition. They defined what is called the Kriya Yoga. You may have heard of Paramahamsa Yogananda, you may have heard of Sri M, so they follow what is called a Nath tradition. So they all took certain aspects of it and emphasized that for the rest, right? So, and then Hatha Yoga took the physical aspects of it and started working with, starting at the physical body level and then into the spiritual level, right? But Patanjali starts at the spiritual level, the mental level first, and doesn't go too much into the physical aspects, except to say that Well, I think I'll cover that later, but we'll. So there were many traditions along the way. Correct. All right. So let's see what Patanjali has to say. So in the very second sutra, so he defines yoga. So this is a definition. And I must say that in many of these scriptures, including Upanishads or even Gita for that matter, the way it's written is that the very first part itself gives you what you need to know right up front. They don't build it up and eventually say what it is. So for instance, here, yoga is defined right up front. If you just know these two, you're done, right? So the reason they do this is if you are, people are in different stages. We are all in different stages of evolution, spiritually, if you will. So if somebody is at a higher stage of evolution, for them, it is just a reminder, just to see the very first few sutras or slokas, and you're done. You just need to go. You don't need to know anything more, right? So it's just a refresher. So they all tend to have the same pattern, which is to give the essence of the teaching right up front. In the Gita, it's the second chapter. If you know the second chapter, you're done. You don't need to go any further. In the same way, the second and third sutra here defines yoga as the cessation of modifications in the mind. So chitta is roughly translated to mind. Vritti is the modifications. So in other words, Patanjali is pointing to something very important here, which is that the stillness of mind is yoga. When the mind becomes really still, you are in yoga. Okay, now the next, he says, then what happens if there is stillness? If you're able to achieve that stillness, then what happens? And then he goes on to say that you are now, the witness rests in its own high nature, true nature, or the higher nature. Okay, so obviously there's a lot to unpack here. People have written books just based on these two sutras. There's a lot. But with respect to our topic here, there's something important, which is that this true nature, again, people have explained this, and we'll see that very quickly here. Okay, before we go, is that of happiness. So here, there is this link back to stillness of the mind and connecting that with the inner source or the higher nature, which is that of happiness. And we'll see that in the next couple of slides. So what we...
Kishore, sorry, one thing. What does that 1.2 mean? What does one stand for?
So there are 4 chapters in the Yoga Sutras. First chapter, second sutra, and first chapter, third sutra. Which are the first, that's right. Okay. Now, when you read that, many people have written commentaries on the Yoga Sutras, because the sutra themselves, as you saw, it's very, very concise, right? And on purpose written that way. It is supposed to give you an immediate, it's supposed to give you the sense of immediately remember more things based on just reading that sutra, right? So that's how it's written. So in other words, a calm and peaceful mind, which is able to maintain equipoise in all situations, experiences unconditional happiness. This is kind of the translation, if you will, that people have written saying this is exactly what Patanjali meant, right? And we'll see more of this. So as you read more about this and understand it a little bit more, you realize that what it's trying to say, yoga is trying to say, is happiness is our real nature. And you will only find it, the source of happiness, you'll only find it inside ourselves, right? So, and this, again, I'm tying to what we also, that happiness as it relates to external things doesn't last. Why is that so? When we relate it back to this, we see that, hey, as long as, if you see the happiness as our real nature, and we'll see more here, you realize that in some ways, what you're looking for outside, what we are looking for outside in different people, place, things, situations, is already inside you. I jokingly put this guy looking for empty, there's nothing in the fridge, but he's probably eaten it all up. And it's like, leaving the car keys in our jacket pocket and looking everywhere. but then finally you realize that it's actually within you, in your pocket, right? And the relief that comes out of the fact that, wow, it's right here. So, we hardly look for it. Here's the keys at the top of this, and we are looking for it everywhere, right? So it's almost like that. We are looking for it everywhere, but what yoga is pointing to is that it's actually inside you. The source of happiness is inside you. Okay, and here is a clue that one of the Upanishads points out, saying this is how they studied. This is again going back to the rishis who studied this in deep meditative states, but they also understood deep sleep. They said in deep sleep, we do not experience pain. When we say deep sleep, so there is waking state, and there's a dream state, and then there is a deep sleep state. We are talking about the deep sleep. We usually come out of deep sleep and say, hey, I had a really, really awesome sleep. I slept like a baby, right? This is what we say after the fact. But in deep sleep, we do not experience pain, right? So that is a clue here. Why? What happens? Even if I go into deep sleep under distress, right? I'm under a lot of distress, a lot of pain, emotionally, physically, what have you, but in deep sleep, everything is gone, right? A rich man and a poor man, they sleep in the same way in deep sleep. So they realized that, and they said, there's something more to it. We need to know this. Okay, but then this is not our experience. Yoga says it's within you, but that's not how we experience things. It's not. So wait a minute, what's going on here, right? This is not how I experience it. So it goes on to say this, right? That our nature, which is represented here is in yellow, our true nature of happiness is hidden by multiple layers of what they call as kleshas, or mental impurities, and then on top of that, there's the mental wandering, or the associated thinking of the mind. Which leads to the mind being in a constant agitated state. We constantly. When was the last time the mind, we experienced stillness, complete stillness, right? Our mind is constantly on the move. It's never present right here, right now, right? And then on top of that, there is this aspect of ignorance, which we may not cover today. But then these three layers cover it. And because of this cover, we are not experiencing it in the way, we are not experiencing the true source of happiness. So that's the reason yoga Patanjali talks about in the Yoga Sutras. So let's take an example here, just to understand it a little bit more. Let's say there is a source of light at the bottom of the lake. And let's say this lake is deep. The lake is muddy initially, and there is a lot of wind, because of which there's a lot of waves on the surface of the lake. You cannot see that light. We cannot see that light. It's dispersed, right? And to see the light clearly, the sediments must settle down. Now, those are the impurities. That needs to settle down. The lake is like the mind in this case, in this example. And then there must be no waves on the surface or no mental distractions. And when these conditions are true, the light shines through. Now, you can also say yet another way, which is also another example used in the scriptures, where they say the moon can reflect on the surface of the water very, very clearly, only if there are no sediments and there are no waves on the surface, right? Now, this kind of gives you a sense of what they're talking about. And this is the reason why we don't experience that happiness. So again, there's a little bit of theory here. I'll just touch upon it, not going to spend too much time. The way in yoga, it's split, our physical body and the physiological body, mental aspects. There is a body, there's mind, intellect. Well, there is ego as on top of that. But basically, there is the mind that deals with the emotional aspects of it and sensory perception. There is intellect that's more around judgment, discrimination, right? And the source of happiness, as yoga defines it, they use the word called Purusha in yoga. And the same concept is called as Atman in Vedanta, as an example. Purusha is the source, as yoga calls it, right? And it is there everywhere, and hence that's the source that's available, but it's reflected through the mind. Just like and the mind needs to be in a certain state of purity for that to reflect, and that's how you see the happiness. So, connecting it back to our experience, though, in daily life, what then happens is when we achieve things, when we buy things, or when we are in a certain situation that we strongly desire and we get it, we have achieved it, what happens is there is a lot of relief. Before achieving it, the mind was in distress. Will I get it? Will I not get it? And so on. There's a lot of anxiety. And when we achieve it, all those anxieties are gone. The mind, at least for a temporary period of time, becomes still. And when that happens, the source of happiness is able to reflect on that mind, and we experience, and we call that happiness. And we wrongly, though, associated with that achievement or what we thought or bought or the situation we found ourselves in. But what really gave us that happiness is the fact that the mind became still, at least for a certain period of time, because of an external situation, granted, but then the final reason is because the mind became still, and because of which the source of happiness was able to reflect more better there, right? So that's the essence of what yoga is trying to say with respect to why we find ourselves not experiencing that source when we can. And it's trying to tell us that it's possible for each one of us to be happy, to experience that long term happiness, and you can be there. You don't, and it's independent of, as you can see, it's independent of anything outside. It's not saying, hey, do this and then you'll be happy, or do this ritual and then you'll be, none of that. It is asking you to go inward and find that source, right? So with that, and then yoga says, let's see how to do it. Let's show you how. Let's give you the roadmap. So obviously the practice then comes down to removing these three layers or reducing these layers: impurities, mental wandering, and ignorance. Mental impurities, we spoke about the anger, greed, and so on. How do you reduce them? How, it almost seems like that's part of our character in some ways, that we are in a certain way, but things can change. Things do change. There is a lot of, in fact, scientific evidence of brain being elastic and the fact that it changes over time. And it kind of relates to that in some ways. So reduce the mental impurities. At a conceptual level, this is what it means then. Reduce the mental wandering and gain the real knowledge. Okay. So in other words, we go from what gives happiness. We were looking for what are the different things that is going to make me happy, to what is happiness, right? So that's the mindset shift that yoga wants us to have, right? And the fact that it becomes clear over time that it cannot be sought outside. All right. Now, yoga, the way it treats our physical, mental, the different parts of our body, if you will, is in 5 sheets, almost like these 5 Matrushka dolls that we may have seen. So that is what is called the anatomical layer, the physical layer. And there's a reason why I mentioned this, so I'll relate it back. There's a physiological level, which includes breathing, digestion. These are things that happen without us having to do anything, right? It happens. So that's the pranamaya kosha, as they call it, or the life force prana driving that. And then there is sensory perception. And we have 5 sense organs, and everything we know, we learn, everything is coming through these 5 sense organs. Think about it, right? What we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Everything about the world is through these sense organs, and it's getting converted at the mind level into a mental picture. So if you look at what we see, or the sight itself, it's not the eyes, but what is behind the eyes. The eyes are just the physical, the one that captures the light, but then behind it, there is more going on, which converts this light into forms that eventually get formed inside the mind. Okay, so again, the Yoga Sutras goes into detail with respect to and explaining this. Similarly, what we hear and so on. So the picture gets happened or formed inside the mind, right? So that's the Manomaya Kosha. And the emotions base and then our memory, those are all at that level. Intellect is further behind mind and brings the rational side of things, right? We can hear this, the voice in our own head, actually. On one side, there are emotions and other things. On the other side, there might be a voice in your head that says, you need to get up today. You need to get up early today. Wake up. Or, there is a voice in our head that we can relate to that's coming from the intellect. And then there's causal body beyond what we can go today. But basically, you experience causal body in deep sleep. So they call it Anandamaya Kosha. This is what we resolve to when we are in deep sleep. So this is how yoga lays out our body. Yet another way of looking at it, this is a really, really interesting analogy from one of the Upanishads called the Katha Upanishad. Basically, it's like 5 sense organs. Those are the 5 horses. The reins is the mind, right? And then the buddhi is the charioteer, and Purusha or Atman is the passenger. So, and the chariot itself is the body, and the path on which it goes is life. So this is the analogy from the Upanishad where it says, it wants the key concept here being, you want the intellect to drive the mind and the mind to be in control of the sense organs, right? And that's how you you go down the right way. But if the sense organs, if the horses decide, hey, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there, you're not going to go anywhere. You're going to fall down the ditch somewhere. So that's kind of the analogy here that's painted. And yet another conceptual way of looking at the yoga practice is at the physical body. Many of us are currently if you look at it as tension and pain, the natural state is that of wanting to be relaxed. So in nature, there is a centered state or a natural state for everything. And then when it's deviated from the natural state on either side, there is a tendency to want to come back to the center, right? Be it a pendulum, be it anything else, there is a natural state where things are stable. So you want to come back to that stable state. And what is that stable state for the physiological body? We are currently in a fast, if you look at our own breath, it's shallow, it's fast, it's restricted. You want to come to a deeper state of breathing, a slow breathing, right? And similarly for the mind, it's in a state of agitation. You want to bring it to a calm mind which experiences peace and is present and still, right? So, and what is the equivalent practice on the other side? And we'll go into it a little bit more. But this is how it lays out in terms of attacking at every kosha or every sheath that we saw in the previous slide. It's saying at each of those sheaths, how do you bring each sheath to its natural state? Through our, obviously, our lifestyle today, things have moved on to different, we are far away from the center. We want to bring it back. And when that happens, that's when the kind of resonance happens, if you will.
Kishore, how many more slides? Do you need one more session, or are you good with today? Hey, how you everyone? Do you have a few more minutes? I'm just checking because.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Do we have like 10 minutes, max 10 minutes more?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead. I just want to check with you. If you have more slides, maybe it's better to have like one more sessions if you want, because it's interesting and you did a lot of work.
No, if there's 10 more minutes, we can finish.
Yeah, we are good. So hopefully nobody has any suggestions. We go ahead. I don't want to take.
All right, sounds good. Okay. So then the practice itself, the core of the Yoga Sutras is this thing called Ashtanga Yoga, or the 8 limbs of yoga, right? I'll give you a sense of it. Basically, there are these, they call it 8 limbs and not steps. It's not like you complete one and then go to the next, complete second and go to the third. Instead, they are working in consort with each other. So all of these things are done at the same, one leading to the other in some ways, but at the same time, another one strengthening a different one, and so on. As an example here, to take a look at the yamas and niyamas, as they call it. These are foundational practices. They say, hey, this is how you want to. These are social ethics and the personal ethics, if you will. If I take an example, there are 5 yamas and 5 niyamas. One of the top most yama is that of ahimsa, right, or non-violence. But when we just listen to non-violence, it seems, yeah, okay, I get it. That's obviously we are not violent. We don't go and hit anybody physically. That doesn't happen. But then again, you peel the layers of the onion, you see non-violence is not just at the physical level. It is now at the speech level. Can we be non-violent at the speech level? What does that mean? Can I not say anything that's hurtful to anybody? That's hard, right? At all times. We're talking about at all times, right? At the speech level. And then the third one is at the level of thought. Can I not have a non-violent thought? What does that mean? How do I achieve that, right? So Patanjali sets the bar really high, but he gives us these gradations. So just giving you a sense of what that means, right? So again, why are yamas and niyamas important here? Why not just use something like meditation? Because today I hear this at all times, right? I mean, there's calm, or there is headspace and what have you, and just go meditate. But people who meditate would tell you that's the hardest thing to do. Why? Because the mind is not used to staying still. The body is not used to sitting still in one place. We are not used to that. But that's the prerequisite. So I jokingly, kind of half jokingly say, if you want to do 30 minutes of meditation, it really depends what you have done the other 23 and a half hours. Because it's impossible to sit even for 5 minutes in silence if what we have done in the other 23 and a half hours is not conducive to that, right? So that's where yamas and niyamas come in. How do we deal with life? How do we deal with people? How do we deal with our situations? Moderation is a good example today, especially whether it's social media or the phone or anything else. Now, how do we don't want to say don't do it at all, but can we moderate ourselves from many of these things that are more sensory pleasure oriented, right? And so on. So that's yamas and niyamas. So yet another one is, hey, we start doing work. We are all engaged in some form of work and or the other, right? Be it at home, different roles that we play. You're a father, your mother, your brother, son, what have you. And each of these roles requires us to perform certain work with respect to that role. Now, Karma Yoga is about immersing ourselves in that work without attachment to a specific outcome. Now, why is this important? Again, I'll tie it back to how Patanjali describes yoga, which is stillness of the mind, right? So the whole goal is to see how can we stay as close as possible to stillness. How can we be reduce the mental agitation? So if you really think about it, our mind is a tool, right? Intellect is a tool. Is it possible for us to use the tool when we want to use it and put it aside, just like any other tool that we have in the house? We use it and we put it aside, right? It's not constantly agitating when we don't want it. Mind is no longer like that. If you see our mind and intellect, it's constantly working. There is agitation at all times. So what Patanjali is referring to is, can we reduce and eliminate most of the mental modifications at will? All of these things, for instance, lead us towards that. So by developing the right attitude towards how we do it, and building the right intention, we can actually experience flow in work, right? As Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a positive psychology psychologist, he mentioned, he has written a book called Flow, but basically you get into the flow in work. But when all of you may have experienced this at one point or the other, whether it's in arts or in any other field, when you are completely engaged, fully immersed in work, you're no longer thinking about what happens at the end of it, what outcome, how much am I going to get paid, or what am I going to recognize, who's going to recognize me, and so on and so forth. You're completely engaged. So it's asking you to do exactly that. That's the right attitude with which it's asking us to go for it, right? Anyway, so I'll speed up a little bit here. And then it talks about, so this is the only, one of the 3 sutras about asana. This is pretty much what Patanjali has to say, saying sthira sukham asanam, which is stability and sukham. So sukham is also, it's explained as when we breathe in a certain way, when the mind is not agitated, the breath is unrestricted. You will notice this. It's very calm, very deep. So it wants us to do that in an effortless way, right? And now pranayama, you may have heard of this term. It's basically regulating the in-breath and out-breath, right? And then there is retention of the breath once you take in. And then there is also retention after you breathe out. So there are 4 aspects to pranayama. Now, why is this important? Why is pranayama important? Now, the ancient rishis found out that breath and the mind are so connected, right? Now, breath actually is an external expression of prana, or the life force. But that same life force drives the thoughts in our mind. So it drives the breath, it results in that expression, but it is the one that also drives thoughts. But the interesting thing is, you can use the breath as a lever. It's the external lever that's available to us with which we can control the thoughts in our mind. Okay, so they found this relation, and it's a transitive relationship. Conversely, in meditation, as you calm your mind, you will realize that the breath comes down and it becomes so shallow that sometimes you don't even need to breathe. For seconds, for minutes, right? So it's a transitive relationship between these 2, thoughts in the mind and the breath. So this is powerful. If you really think about it, and prana is driving this, the one that uses the prana the most, guess what? It's the constant thoughts in our mind that is the biggest consumer and of prana. So even half an hour meditation, which reduces this agitation in the mind, you will realize you have an entire day's, full night's sleep worth of energy given back to you, and you will see that, right? So, that's why pranayama is important, right? And the mental wandering, as we saw, that is the practice mentioned is that of meditation. Now, we want to know, what is meditation? What does Patanjali say about meditation? He's given a wonderful definition here. So he says the first part of meditation is what is called dharana, right? There are 3 parts of the 3 limbs, if you will: dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. Out of which dharana is, when currently the mind is scattered, it's going in different places, it's all over the place. From that, to bring it to one. So draw the attention to one thing first, which is concentration, right? And then as that develops, it goes into a state where you no longer have to bring it back. You don't have to put effort to bring back the mind to that one thing that you're focusing on, that object that you're focusing on. Instead, it becomes it effortlessly stays there. And when that happens, that state is called dhyana or meditation, right? And then the way he explains this is that state where the contents of the mind are identical from one moment to the next. In other words, it's the same thing. So the beautiful examples given here, one is that of when you pour hot oil from a vessel, the oil is actually flowing, but when you look from far, it seems like there is actually a small transparent tube there. It doesn't feel as if it's flowing. It feels like it's the same thing. It's a solid thing, but it's actually oil flowing, right? So that's the example given in the in the commentaries, it becomes effortless. Okay. So that is meditation, right? And that's again, going back to slowing down the mind, reducing the thoughts, and getting to that state. And as you do this constantly, consistently, even in normal life, even when you're outside the mat, it starts to become that way. It's like the gym, right? You go practice in the gym, and then later on, that strength is available to you. Or when you practice, if you're in an art field, that is available to you at any other time. You're at your recall. It's in the same way. And this is yet another really interesting one. It's called Pratipaksha Bhavana, or the opposite thought. Again, Patanjali goes into what happens, these negative thoughts that happen in our mind. We didn't ask for it. It shows up, right? It's as if you don't have direct control over it. It comes from the subconscious, and it is right there. Now, Patanjali says that when that happens, when these things come from the subconscious, consciously bring up an opposite thought to counter the negative thought. You bring it up consciously, right? So, and do this again and again and again. And over time, the negative thoughts don't come anymore. The strength slowly reduces, and eventually you will no longer get those negative thoughts in the first place. But this is the way Patanjali explains in terms of countering negative thoughts. And to eventually, obviously, results in positivity at the end of it. So this is Pratipaksha Bhavana. Not part of the Ashtanga Yoga, but he mentions this as a way to train your mind. And then, we meet different types of people in our lives. And here is a general concept he mentions. He says, when we see other people who are very happy and whatnot, today it's even more. We see them on Facebook saying, oh yeah, I've gone to all these places, I'm very happy, blah, blah, blah. He says that can cause jealousy in others. It can cause, hey, it seems like everybody else in the world is super happy except me, right? How do you prevent that kind of thought from happening? In fact, you can apply one of the four, which is called Maitri. He says, develop friendliness towards people who are happy, right? You would never be unhappy if your friend is happy. So develop friendliness, develop compassion towards people who are suffering, so that you will no longer feel that, hey, I'm better than this person who's suffering right now. Instead, I'll feel compassionate towards them. Develop joy towards people who are virtuous, and to develop, the last one is an interesting one. For people who are wicked or not doing things the way it should be, he says, develop indifference. That's one way of looking at it. Equanimity is another, but basically saying you can't change them. Don't worry about giving advice. It's their journey. Anyway, so some final thoughts here. All this might start to look like, hey, wait a minute. Are you saying that I shouldn't buy that bigger house or go for that promotion or start that startup or anything else, etc., right? We are not saying that at all. Yoga doesn't say that. Instead, it says, when you're doing that, and again, relates back to your question, Sony, from earlier, do it from happiness, not for happiness. So in other words, don't depend on it for happiness. Instead, you're already happy. Your source is inside you, but don't do it for it. So that's the answer given. But obviously, all this takes time. It's an effort, just like with anything else. Learning a musical instrument takes 10,000 hours to master, as an example. This also is going to take time, no doubt. But as you go through it, you'll realize that it's useful to understand that, hey, just because I went for a 10-day course and I come back, things are just not going to change overnight. It's going to take some time. So we can measure ourselves. You don't have to tell anybody else under 3 dimensions. So if I got angry earlier 8 out of 10 times, has that reduced to 5 out of 10 times? Is it trending lower? How intense was my anger, as an example? How intense and how quickly was I able to recover back? FIR, we can measure ourselves along these 3 dimensions and see where we are we making progress, right? And stress, obviously, is another one that we feel today. We see it everywhere. How do we, stress has a lot, as I go through my yoga journey, I realize how much stress, problem stress can create. Not just, starts at the mind level. If you think about it, starts at the mind level and slowly eats away quite a bit at the physical level. It starts showing up, right? So various ways in which these things happen, both at the physiological level and physical level. So it's important to take care of that. And the other part is, hey, we have seen enough of life to know that there are many potholes along the way. There are. We better be prepared, isn't it? It's not a question of if we are going to get into one, it's a question of when. In fact, last week was a good example where, you know, as some of you know, I work in a startup, and 100% of the money was in SVB. Right? So Silicon Valley Bank. So we go into the weekend on Friday, not knowing whether salary will be paid out on Tuesday, right? So all the money was stuck and there was no way to take the money out. So my point being, life throws these things at you. There is no doubt. We've seen it again and again and again. So the question is, are we ready to handle it? And the insurance that we can, as you know, insurance doesn't, you cannot take an insurance after the fact. The insurance has to be before. And to me, this is one way in which we build insurance before the fact, right? And we can be prepared. So just to summarize what we spoke, and sorry it took a little longer, we looked at the problem statement. We inquired into what is happiness, and we learned that the true happiness can only be found inside. And we saw some of the practices, as mentioned in yoga, to be able to tap into that infinite source of happiness that's out here, when instead of looking at the small amounts of happiness that we see outside. So that's that's everything that I had to say today. I really appreciate you all joining today, and I'm happy to stay as long as you want, if there are any questions. But I know I've taken more time of your evening and afternoon. So appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you can stop the video. That questions we don't want to record, right? Or do you want to record? Yeah.
Hold on. I don't. Let me quickly see how to stop. Yeah, stop recording. There you go.